Good morning and welcome, friends. Today is a special day. We are commemorating the life and work of Mr. Crosby. He was a staunch member of the TS in the 1900s. He worked diligently all through his years after joining it, and we owe it to him that today the original writings and the Theosophy, pure and simple, exists in the world. Mr. Crosby was born in Montreal, Canada in 1849, January 10, 1849. His parents were Scottish. They met in Montreal and married there. And for years, his father was a supervisor for the Hudson Bay Company, so he traveled from place to place. And his wife, the mother of Mr. Crosby, was companion to Lady Simpson, the governor of Hudson Bay Company. She was a Highlander with second sight, but she barely used it. She was a very compassionate, kind, and service-oriented woman. Mr. Crosby was invited to join the communion at 16. They were Presbyterian. And he refused, saying that he did not feel he was ready. And when he questioned life, death, birth, the purpose of life, what is the highest achievable, how do we do it, he felt that the questions did not receive answers that were appropriate from the church. So he decided to search out for himself, and he said, and this is a quote, I want to discover the truth, and this has to be knowledge. So from there on, he tried to fit himself to receive that knowledge. He met a older man, and the two of them decided to start a business in Montreal. So they did start it. It was a leather and shoe business, and it was very successful. Shortly thereafter, he married the daughter of this man, his partner, and thereafter the partner's wife, his mother-in-law, died, and his partner started getting interested in spiritual stuff, but Mr. Crosby did not believe in spiritualism. He went to some of their meetings and he said that there was fraud. And then this actually enabled him to do some research into telepathy, magnetism, clairvoyance. And he said he felt that there was a guiding energy, that he was protected, in other words, and he actually was very respectful of other people's privacy, and he learned to control all these things that he was doing himself. So he came to understand the psychic powers latent in men and how they're exhibited. And later on, in 1869, his partner and himself were offered an opportunity to sell their business, and they did do that, and then they moved to Boston. In 1886 to 1888, Mr. Crosby was told that the TS was coming to open a branch there, and he went to their first meeting, and he said afterwards, "This is what I was waiting for." So he really found what he was looking for. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Judge came to talk at the Boston branch, and this is when he met Mr. Judge. And he says, and this is a quote, "A friend of all time and of the future." And he says the first thing he read was his epitome, and this he says, changed the current of his life for the rest of it. And he said, I have learned to trust him, and that trust has never been broken. So it just shows how one meeting with the right person can change the direction of one's life. So Mr. Judge and Mr. Crosby became companions, and when Judge came from New York to Boston, he stayed with Mr. Crosby, and the opposite was also true, that when Crosby went to New York, he stayed with Mr. Judge. In 1888, he becomes the secretary and then the president of the inner section of the TS. And I think it was during this period that Mr. Judge put him in charge of the New England states, and so he was very busy trying to manage those that came under his guidance. In 1888-89, the Boston branch nominated him to be the president, and as said, he did become that. Crosby was present in 1891 when HPB passed from this physical life. Besant, John, and he were present, and he made a note of this meeting for everyone to read later on. His first marriage failed. They decided to separate and then divorced. Mr. Crosby sold the business and left the house and all the proceeds to his first wife. They had a very ill child who needed constant care, and someone had to be hired to give that care. He married his second wife, Josephine, in 1890, and during this period we see that the Theosophical Society is going through tremendous difficulties. After HPB's passing, Hargrove and Nischerheimer, who were two prominent members in New York, went through the papers and kind of hoisted Tingley to become the head of the TS. This had tremendous repercussions because when Mr. Judge was not on the scene, these beings, when they come, they are there to establish continuity from the masters and the messenger, being HPB. Mr. Judge stayed in his body 5 years longer than HPB, but he was not a successor. He was a co-worker with HPB during her life. He simply just maintained his body 5 years longer than HPB did. And when people expect someone to kind of fit into that position, that is never indicated, or that title successor given to anyone. In these matters, we get to know the beings through occultism of our own. They're not visible as they are to the outside world. They're not physical bodies. They're spiritual beings. So Tingley was a member just for 1 year, and she took over, became sole, like a despot, sole organizer of the TS, decided to change its name to Universal Brotherhood, and then moved it to California. Mr. Crosby was in Boston during this period, so he really did not know what the inner condition of the TS in New York was. And he said later on that he trusted the opinion and the judgment of these individuals who were in New York working with Mr. Judge and then Tingley, of course, afterwards. He really did not know the internal affairs at that time. So when Tingley moved to California, requested that Mr. Crosby join her, he did. He actually sold all of his he sold his business, his house, and he and his wife and his family moved to California, and he turned all of his assets to the TS at that time. He stayed there for 1900 to 1904, but after 2 years he says he quite understood as to why some of the members in New York had resigned after getting to know Tingley while they were there. And he faced Tingley face to face and told her that she was moving away from the lines laid down, was not secretive about it, and told her that he was going to leave if she did not change the course of business for the TS. So when that did not happen, he actually left with his family, his wife, and came to Pasadena. His wife and him, they rented a house there. They had not a penny to their names because the assets were not returned to them. He found a job with the Times newspaper and worked there. During this period, he got to know his neighbors, and they decided to start a study class, and they did. The study class eventually enabled them to start the ULT. In 1909, after the study class, he actually established the ULT, and this is our Mother Lord in California. Between 1909 and 1919, until his death on June 25, 1919, he worked diligently for Theosophy. He never denied any help to anyone. He was a very simple being, and his main word was impersonality, that in whatever we do for Theosophy, we need to be impersonal, but relying on the principles. So he brought the second division of the TS back to its original lines. He also brought the esoteric section of the TS back to its original lines. In these affairs, to remain loyal to the founders of the movement, to remain loyal to the established way of giving out the simple fundamental truths of Theosophy to humanity as projected by the masters of wisdom at that time was his main objective. And he remained faithful to these beings whom he trusted and he loved, and he worked diligently until his death. He suffered tremendously before his release from the physical body, never complained. He lived a calm, composed, concentrated life, and he exhibited the same powers during his departure from the earth life. This sketch is very brief. It will be followed by 3 readings. Then there will be an overview of his work and influence, and then we will follow that with a 4th reading, which will conclude our program.
This is a reading from the writings of Mr. Crosby. When we're convinced of the truth of a matter, there's no reason why we should not voice that conviction as strongly as the case demands. But there's no reason why, in such case, we should demand acceptance of it. In our case, we do not demand acceptance of Theosophy. We point out its principles and their applications. Theosophy makes certain statements as being matters of knowledge by perfected men, but not as statements to be believed. It is shown that such knowledge, being acquired by them from observation and experience in many bodies, can be reached by all men, and the ways to do so are pointed out. Do we doubt our ability? As long as we really do so, we shall never make much success. We learn to know our ability by using it to the limit. Mistakes need not worry us, if they represent conscientious and unwearied efforts. We can learn through the mistakes we make. It is pure selfishness to desire to know that any advice course will benefit us. Advice can be given, but knowledge is acquired. Personal results should not be looked for. We should do things because they are the right things to do, and not because they will be of benefit to us. All our vacillations, fears, and despondencies arise from personal attitudes. HPB says the progress of the ego is a series of progressive awakenings. Not being sticks nor stones, but human beings, we must feel success or failure. The wisdom is shown in not being swelled up by the one or cast down by the other. We should make a steady, unvarying pursuit of that which is seen to be right. To point out where a system of thought is inadequate, however, is not tearing it down. The motto of Theosophists is, "There is no religion higher than truth," and all philosophies must be able to stand the most rigid and critical examination in its light, or they're valueless. Everything must stand upon its own merits. The average mind of the day is still under the sway of superstition, of dogma, and authority, and must remain so for some time to come. Meeting frequently those who have broken loose from old forms to engulf themselves, and what is worse, others in newer forms of the same old errors, we can but keep on the straight path we know, making a trail that these very ones may follow in the future. We need not be distressed that they cannot now see. Their time will come, for all these things are provided for in the vastness of time. We have but to go on with the work. We have but to keep continually in mind and heart the original lines laid by HPB and WQJ, namely, unity first, as a focus for spiritual growth and mutual strength. Study that a knowledge of the movement, its purpose, its teachers, and its message may be had. Work upon ourselves in the light of that study, and for others, first, last, and all the time.
This reading is from the writings of H.P. Blavatsky. The wisdom religion is the inheritance of all the nations, the world over. Our idea of the unknown universal deity, represented by karma, is that it is a power which cannot fail, and can therefore have neither wrath nor mercy, only absolute equity, which leaves every cause, great or small, to work out its inevitable effects. The saying of Jesus, "With what measure you meet it shall be measured to you again," neither by expression nor implication points to any hope of future mercy or salvation by proxy. This is why, recognizing as we do in our philosophy the justice of this statement, we cannot recommend too strongly mercy, charity, and forgiveness of mutual offenses. Resist not evil, and render good for evil are Buddhist precepts, and were first preached in view of the implacability of karmic law. For man to take the law into his own hands is anyhow a sacrilegious presumption. Human law may use restrictive, not punitive measures, but a man who, believing in karma, still revenges himself and refuses to forgive every injury, thereby rendering good for evil, is a criminal and only hurts himself. It is an occult law that no man can rise superior to his individual failings without lifting, be it ever so little, the whole body of which he is an integral part. In the same way, no one can sin nor suffer the effects of sin alone. When every individual has contributed to the general good, what he can of money, of labor, and of ennobling thought, then, and only then, will the balance of national karma be struck. And until then we have no right nor any reasons for saying that there is more life on the earth than nature can support. All pain and suffering are results of want of harmony, and that the one terrible and only cause of the disturbance of harmony is selfishness in some form or another. Hence karma gives back to every man the actual consequences of his own actions without any regard to their moral character, but since he receives his due for all, it is obvious that he will be made to atone for all sufferings which he has caused, just as he will reap in joy and gladness the fruits of all the happiness and harmony he had helped to produce. It is disbelief in the just law of retribution that is more likely to awaken every combative feeling in man. A child, as much as a man, resents a punishment or even a reproof he believes to be unmerited far more than he does a severer punishment if he feels that it is merited. Belief in karma is the highest reason for reconcilement to one's lot in this life, and the very strongest incentive toward effort to better the succeeding rebirth. Make men feel and recognize in their innermost hearts what is their real true duty to all men, and every old abuse of power, every iniquitous law in the national policy based on human, social, or political selfishness will disappear of itself.
This reading is from the writings of William Q. Judge. Some years ago, one of those masters in whom so many of our members believe directed HPB to write a letter for him to a certain body of Theosophists. In this he said that each member could become, in his own town or city, if earnest, sincere, and unselfish, an active center from which would radiate unseen powerful forces, able to influence men and women in the vicinity for good, and that soon inquirers would appear, a branch in time be organized, and thus the whole neighborhood would receive benefit. This seems just and reasonable in addition to its being stated by such high authority. Members ought to consider and think over it as so that action may follow. To many who think themselves theosophically alone in their own town, have folded their hands and shut up their minds, saying to themselves that they could do nothing, that no one was near who could possibly care for Theosophy, and that that particular town was the most difficult for the work. The great mistake in these cases is forgetting the law indicated in what HPB wrote. It is one that every member ought to know, that the mind of man is capable of bringing about results through means of other minds about him. If we sit and think that nothing can be done, then our subtle mind meets other minds within the radius of our sphere, not small, and shouts into them, "Nothing can be done." Of course, then nothing is done. If unselfishly and earnestly we think Theosophy, and desire that others should, like us, be benefited by it, then to the minds we meet in stray moments of the day, and in many hours of the night, we cry, "Theosophy," and "Help and hope for thee." The result must be an awakening of interest upon the slightest provocative occasion. Such an inner attitude to every sort of attempt at promulgation will disclose many unsuspected persons who are thinking along this very line. Thus will the opportunity of the hour be taken advantage of. The masters have said that this is a transition age, and he who has ears to hear will hear what has thus been said. We are working for the new cycles and centuries. What we do now in this transition age will be like what the great Dion Chohans did in the transition point, the midway point in evolution. at the time when all matter and all types were in transition and fluid state. They then gave the new impulse for the new types, which resulted later in all the vast varieties of nature. In mental development, we are now at the same point. And what we now do in faith and hope for others and for ourselves will result similarly on the plane to which it is all directed. Thus, in other centuries, we will come out again and go on with it. If we neglect it now, so much the worse for us then. Hence, we are not working for some definite organization of the new years to come, but for a change in the manas and buddhi of the race. That is why it may seem indefinite, but it is nevertheless very defined and very great in scope.
The work of Mr. Crosby. There's a summary of his work right here, but we're going to go through all that. You may not be able to read any of it, or not close to the board anyway. Yes, he, as his first speaker mentioned on his work, his life became Theosophy as he came to understand Theosophy and become involved in the movement. The work, the impulse, the motivation, the tireless activity which led Robert Crosby to eventually form the United Lodge of Theosophists saved the original, genuine teachings of Theosophy from oblivion. The teachings of HPB might still be out of print and largely unavailable today, were it not for Robert Crosby and a few ULTers who took it upon themselves at great personal expense to revive publication of the exact teachings of HPB and William Q. Judge. So it can truly be said that Robert Crosby rescued Theosophy. HPB was known as the creator of Theosophy. Mr. Judge was a preserver. And Robert Crosby was known as a regenerator. Okay. HPB, the teacher, she was a messenger and the message in one. The nature of her work exposed her, as the first speaker indicated, to the slings and arrows of selfish interests in religion, in science, and the Theosophical Society, which were imperiled by her mission or overshadowed by her greatness. HPB referred to Mr. Judge as being the preserver of Theosophy and the heart and soul of the esoteric section. Upon her death, Mr. Judge became the target for attacks upon her, only at last to become victim, as she had been, to treachery within the society. There's always one witness on the scene. After the death of Mr. Judge, Robert Crosby rose up to keep the link unbroken. Few realize that this earnest man, whose heart and soul were assimilated to the nature of HPB and WQJ, was the agent for regeneration of the Theosophical movement on the lines laid down by the Masters. So HPB was the creator, WQJ was the preserver, and Robert Crosby was the regenerator of pure Theosophy. After the death of HPB, Mr. Judge gave out such statements in regard to her nature and mission as, if taken, would have shown the students where to find the link of the Zon, the ancient fountain of knowledge. So, in like manner, after the death of Mr. Judge, Robert Crosby gave out such statements in respect to Mr. Judge as, if taken, would have preserved the unity of all the student body of Theosophists. Mr. Crosby always pointed to our teachers, never to himself. He claimed no credit for authoring the talks and articles he left behind, as they were all based on the work passed on through our teachers. Mr. Crosby showed the way to any students who might, in truth, be seeking the path. One of the few articles for which Mr. Crosby claimed authorship was about his recently deceased friend. The article was titled, "A Friend of Old Time and of the Future." As such does William Q. Judge appear to me, as doubtless he does to many others in this and other lands. Of his extraordinary ability of turning seemingly evils into powers for good, I have had many proofs. That he was a great occultist, many know by individual experience, but none have fathomed the depths of his power and knowledge. The lines have been laid down by us, for us, by HPB and WQJ and the Masters. Robert Crosby steadfastly held the unadulterated message of the Masters as transmitted by HPB and WQJ amongst usurpers, traitors, and their unsuspecting followers. Stick to the messengers and the message, he would say, in quoting from a Master's letter. He noted that ingratitude is not one of their vices. Go on with the work, Mr. Crosby said. We are working in the present for the future. Unless the nature of HPB and WQJ is grasped, Theosophy is not understood and cannot be understood. Mr. Crosby was one of the earliest American members of the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society. He worked unceasingly for the movement in its exoteric and esoteric channels. Few ever suspected his connection with HPB and William Q. Judge was more than casual and incidental. After the passing of Mr. Judge, as the first speaker indicated, Mr. Crosby continued to give his full support to the TS up until the time he saw that that they were not going to stay true to the original teachings. After the official launch by the time of the United Lodge of Theosophists by he and 6 others, which was guided by the declaration that he wrote, Mr. Crosby influenced the return of focus on the original teachings. He, in a letter to all open-minded Theosophists when the ULT was started, invited others to become associates. No formal bond existed among the associates of the ULT, the sole object being the study and dissemination of Theosophy, pure and simple. R.C.'s letter included comments like, Theosophists cannot learn the truth about nature and themselves in any other school than that provided in Theosophy and in the lessons to be learned from self-study and the study of theosophical history. From the beginning, but a handful recognized the gravity of the issues involved and that is still the case, work, the will to study, apply, and so come to understand the play of forces in human nature, the practical application of the third object. And the third object is, I had it just a minute. I know it by heart, but I'm not going around with it. The investigation of the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. Mr. Crosby would refer to the semi-esoteric character of the ULT. He stressed impersonality and anonymity in order to protect the work and to help protect the workers from pride and ambition. He was no believer in diluted theosophy. His loyalty was wholehearted and single-minded. When one of his associates was bemoaning some failure, he said, "Do not grieve over failures and partial successes. It is the effort that counts. He who, with the right motive and with sincere goodwill, does the best that he can, and all that he knows how to do, does enough." Theosophy magazine was formed in November 1912, with Mr. Crosby serving as chief editor until his death. In 1915, Theosophy School was started. In 1916, Because for Children Who Ask Why was edited by Mr. Crosby, and he also set most of the Theosophy School songs to music. Mr. Crosby attended personally to an incessant stream of correspondence from inquirers who came in some way to learn of him and to seek his kindly advice and suggestion. He never denied his help, but gave freely without stint or limit. As the speaker first indicated, June 25th, that's today, he died as he had lived, calm and serene, with no word of complaint during the days of intense suffering that preceded his release. In his last article, Mr. Crosby reiterated the position that theosophy is not a constantly changing set of ideas, but a consistent and complete body of knowledge to be studied, applied, and promulgated as originally presented. Excerpts from obituaries. Thus spoke Robert Crosby in 1909. That which men call death is but a change of location for the ego, a mere transformation, a forsaking for a time of the mortal frame, a short period of rest before one reassumes another human frame in the world of mortals. The Lord of this body is nameless. Dwelling in numerous tenements of clay, it appears to come and go, but neither death nor time can claim it, for it is deathless, unchangeable and pure, beyond time itself and not to be measured. So our old friend and fellow worker has merely passed for a short time out of sight, but has not given up the work begun so many ages ago, the uplifting of humanity, to include the destruction of the shackles that enslave the human mind. No act of his ever led to disunion among theosophists. So the honor given to R.C. is not a personal devotion. It is recognition of and gratitude for services which might have been the part of anyone who saw as he did, and in whom was born the same determination. No reverence, to reverence the name and character of Robert Crosby is to pledge allegiance to practical work for humanity. He stands for that. That the theosophy of H.P. Blavatsky and William Q. Judge is in the world today, that the history of the theosophical movement is of record, that our opportunity to continue the movement itself as it was begun, is not due to any of the Theosophical Society's or successors or leaders, but to the loyalty of Robert Crosby, a humble pupil who chose with his eyes open to follow the footsteps of his predecessors. As regards to himself and his family, Mr. Crosby was always well dressed in public, at work and at lodgerooms, so that Theosophy might not be rated by a poor personal appearance. He made a point of this to all workers. A few months after the death of Mr. Crosby, B.P. Wadia, industrialist and prominent member of the TS, visited Los Angeles, where he heard of Mr. Crosby for the first time. He became active in the work of ULT and was instrumental in spreading the movement with the establishment of ULTs in New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., this lodge, then in London, Paris, Amsterdam, The Hague, and finally Bombay and Bangalore. To this day, there are workers in ULT dedicated to retaining the pristine quality and dedication of those principles that Mr. Crosby had culled from HPB and William Q. Judge and embodied in the Declaration of ULT. TS was at that time keeping a new and revised edition of the Secret Doctrine available to with over 30,000 alterations, and edition had issued spurious third volume. Therefore, in 1925 and 26, ULT reprinted and issued the original edition, which it has reprinted several times and is still available. Notes on the Bhagavad Gita was published in 1928. Mr. Judge had prepared notes for the first 7 chapters before his death. Mr. Crosby prepared the last 11 chapters, 8 to 18, and by reading them it's hard to see that there was a break. He continued on. A photographic reprint of the original edition of Isis Unveiled was issued by ULT in 1930, as Isis was completely out of print by that time. It's still currently available. It was only after he had passed away that his written articles, talk transcripts, and some of his letters were published in book form and under his name. 2 such books titled The Friendly Philosopher and Universal Theosophy are here available. He makes such statements as, "It is to the teachings that attention has to be called, not to ourselves, who are only handing them on as best we can." Answers to questions on the ocean of theosophy was issued in 1937. Mr. Crosby's work was that. All of HPB's and William Q. Judge's books and their magazine articles have been reprinted several times and also on an electronic version available. The prime objective of ULT continues to be to remove all barriers between the student and the message of theosophy as it was presented by HPB and WQJ. Therefore, the original texts are reprinted, and every inquirer is encouraged to approach these 2 teachers directly. So Robert Crosby deserves lasting gratitude of all students of theosophy and all lovers of the wisdom and message transmitted by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and William Quan Judge. Those seeking to truly be in accord with nature's law of universal brotherhood are invited to help us in the work of keeping the link of the teachings unbroken.
This reading is from Robert Crosby himself. Effective theosophical work cannot be done unless there are found persons in the world who can see the necessity for it and will fit themselves more and more to supply the need. That certain persons find such an opportunity is their karma. But what they do with the opportunity depends upon a realization of its importance. Once we see something of what the Theosophical movement means to the world, we are necessary to it. Not as persons, but because we see and do. The movement is accelerated by us to the extent we work for it, and hindered to the extent that we, as it were, let it pull us along. So every student will strive to make himself fitting. A fitting instrument is necessary to the work to his full capacity, soul, mind, and body. Always we act in accordance with the position assumed. So let us take the highest position that is shown by everything in nature. If we take the high position, we need only in accordance with the greatness of the position. We not only act in accordance with the greatness of the position taken, but we come to a realization of it within ourselves, where is all perception of it and fulfillment of it. It is apparent to anybody that the cause of all human troubles is selfishness and ignorance. The ignorance, which is the cause of the selfishness, lies in men's way of thinking, their ideas in regard to life. The prevailing idea is that there is but one life, and that each must struggle for himself as against all others. The very idea contains in it fight, opposition, his hand against every man and every man's hand against him. As long as these ideas prevail in men's minds, they will act selfishly and in opposition where self-interest is concerned. The Theosophist knows what the true way is, that man lives many lives, and that in each life he reaps what he sowed in other lives, as well as in this one. That if every man were to have this knowledge, he would see that true happiness for all can be obtained only when each human being uses all his powers for the good of others. Under such a way of thinking, no man would be allowed to suffer for one moment, because there would be many willing hands to help on every side. The greatest need, then, is to have a right and true philosophy of life. For the following of it will not only bring relief from the many forms of suffering, but a knowledge that will lead humanity to greater heights. The Theosophist works to relieve the cause in the only way possible. Doubtless, if Theosophists were more numerous, they would be found relieving every possible distress to the best of their ability. But unfortunately for the world, they are few, and are thus compelled to put all their energy into calling attention to the true nature of man, and to a philosophy of life, so that more and more minds may be turned that way, and the day of relief brought nearer.
We'll close our celebration of Mr. Crosby's life and work with a quotation from his statements. Everything that comes to us to do contains a lesson for us. We should not forget that ever. What comes at any time contains in it the thing we need. So whether it seems hard, troublesome, or pleasant, there is something in it for us. Thank you for coming.
Next week we have the depth in America, starting of America.